It has been suggested to me that I would do well to define my terms before diving into what I have to say to you this morning. Very specifically, it was suggested that I be very clear about what I mean by Jim Crow justice, and maybe a very brief review of what Jim Crow is and why I am bringing up this bit of American history. Gladly. Back in the mid-1800s, even before the Civil War, Jim Crow became a popular term to refer to African Americans. And after slavery ended and the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, many states and localities enacted laws that both separated and targeted African Americans. These laws came to be known as Jim Crow laws, and I will share a few of them just so you get the flavor of what these were about. Quote, "It shall be unlawful for a Negro and white person to play together or in company with each other in any game of cards or dice, dominoes, or checkers." That's the good state of Alabama. "It shall be unlawful for any white prisoner to be handcuffed or otherwise chained or tied to a Negro prisoner." That was the state of Arkansas. "No colored barber shall serve as a barber to white women or girls." Georgia. "Marriages are void when one party is a white person and the other is possessed of 1/8 or more Negro, Japanese, or Chinese blood." From our neighbor to the northeast, that was Nebraska. Here's a beaut. "Any person presenting for public appearance or general information arguments or suggestions in favor of social equality or of intermarriage between whites and Negroes shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and subject to a fine not exceeding $500 or imprisonment not exceeding 6 months, or both fine and imprisonment at the discretion of the court." So much for free speech in the great state of Mississippi. "Separate free schools shall be established for the education of children of African descent, and it shall be unlawful for any colored child to attend any white school or any white child to attend a colored school." That one was from Missouri, although it was copied in many, many states. "Any white woman who shall suffer or permit herself to be got with child by a Negro or mulatto shall be sentenced to the penitentiary for not less than 18 months. That one's from the enlightened state of Maryland. There were hundreds of these laws, or laws just like these Jim Crow laws, and they existed for generations. They existed until Brown versus the Board of Education declared school segregation to be unconstitutional in 1954, and the rest were voided by the Federal Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Federal Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, that's not even 50 years ago. So why are we talking about Jim Crow justice now when Jim Crow laws were eliminated or done away with in 1965? It's because while explicitly racist laws may be gone, the justice system that we live in still separates and targets African Americans, particularly men. And you should know I'm sourcing much of my information this morning from a book called The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness by Michelle Alexander. You should know that The New Jim Crow was the common read selected by the Unitarian Universalist Association for 2012, last year, and that about 25 of us here at First Unitarian read this book together last winter in a couple of different study groups. You should also know, I don't know if they're still there, but they were there earlier, that Miriam's book table in the community room has a couple of copies available for sale. Because of this book and what it says this morning, we are holding up a number of closely related and, well, a number of closely related truths that are difficult. And they are difficult for a number of closely related reasons. Some of what makes this difficult is realizing the sheer systemic scope of what is currently happening to tens of thousands of people of color in the United States. Some of what makes this difficult is that we don't like to think of our own government perpetuating the kinds of injustice that it is currently perpetuating. And some of this is difficult. Maybe the most difficult part is that to deal with this, to actually faithfully and effectively address the constellation of complex realities of our common life, will require a different kind of conversation than we are used to having. It will be a conversation that acknowledges white privilege, acknowledges white silence and white complicity, and looks deeply at the almost entirely unspoken white cultural assumptions that have led to and that perpetuate this unearned privilege, this silence, and this complicity. To be sure, this is not a sermon of statistics, but a very few statistical facts will highlight why this is so important. Over the last 25 years, the number of people in American prisons has grown from about 350,000 people to 2.3 million people. And if you include not just the people who are currently in prison, but who are under the auspices of the criminal justice system, on parole or in some other way under the auspices of the criminal justice system, we are talking of over 7 million people. Astronomical numbers. It's important to know that crime rates during this time have remained virtually unchanged and even fallen some. We incarcerate more people as a percentage of our population and more people in total than any other nation on earth. Even the most oppressive regime you can name incarcerates fewer people and a lesser percentage than we do. The majority of this increase over the last 25 years can be tied directly to the so-called war on drugs, the associated mandatory sentencing, and don't underestimate this, the federal economic incentives for local police forces to make large numbers of drug arrests. But that's only half the story. Studies repeatedly and consistently show that white people and people of color use illegal drugs about equally, somewhere between 6.5–7.5% of all people abuse or use illegal drugs. But those studies show that while the usage is about equal, most drug dealers are white, and most drug-related crime is perpetrated by white people. So, in a colorblind world, you would, based on population distribution and known drug use, you would expect about 3/4 of the people in prison on drug charges would be white. You would be very, very wrong. Black men are in state prisons on drug charges 13 times more than white people, more than white men. For just one more specific example, in Iowa in 2009, African Americans accounted for less than 3% of the state's population, but more than 26% of the Iowa prison population. In many urban areas, as many as 50% of young black men are involved in the criminal justice system, and in a very few areas, it's as high as 80%. At this moment in time, this morning as we gather, right now, we have more African American men in prison than were living in slavery before the Civil War. There are more African American men in prison than there are in college this morning. We incarcerate more of our racial minorities than any other country anywhere in the world. We should be profoundly ashamed of this national tragedy. And instead, as Michelle Alexander pointedly reminds us, we have been asleep at the wheel. Reverend Fred Small wrote, Alexander's thesis is simple and heartbreaking. The American criminal justice system is so suffused with racism that it effectively recreates the racial caste system known as Jim Crow. And although explicit bias is no longer acceptable, the system operates to label black men criminals and then condemns them as criminals to perfectly legal, race-neutral discrimination in employment, housing, education, public assistance, and voting rights. Exactly what Jim Crow used to do. Imagine, Michelle Alexander writes, imagine you are Emma Faye Stewart, a 30-year-old single African-American mother of two who was arrested as part of a drug sweep in Hearne, Texas. All but one of those people arrested were African-American, and you are innocent. After a week in jail, you have no one to care for your two small children and are eager to get home. Your court-appointed attorney urges you to plead guilty to a lesser drug distribution charge, saying the prosecutor has offered you probation. You refuse, steadfastly proclaiming your innocence. And finally, after almost a month in jail, you decide to plead guilty just so you can return home and get your children. Unwilling to risk a trial and years of imprisonment, you are sentenced to 10 years probation and ordered to pay $1,000 in fines, as well as court and probation costs. You are now branded a drug felon. You are no longer eligible for food stamps. You will, most likely, be discriminated against in employment. You cannot vote for at least 12 years. You are about to be evicted from public housing, and once homeless, your children will be taken away from you and put in foster care. And that's not the end of the story. Because at the trial, when it finally does go to trial, the judge finds that the entire sweep of arrest was based on the testimony of a single informant who lied. And all the cases were dismissed except those who pleaded guilty to a lesser charge. So despite your innocence, you are still a drug felon. You are still homeless. Your children are now wards of the state. This is the world we have created. And I readily confess that for years, like most of us, I suspect, I sort of kind of knew that the system was bad and probably had some racial bias to how it all worked. But I didn't pay close attention to the details or the facts. I kind of sort of knew that there was a huge increase in rates of incarceration and the stupidity of mandatory sentencing. And I was sort of kind of aware of the racial injustice of how our country applies the death penalty. I was sort of kind of aware of the shift from state-run prisons to private, for-profit corporations. And it did occur to me, though, that you don't have to be an economist or a moral philosopher to see that this creates a powerful economic incentive to keep people in prison as long and as cheaply as possible. And could you design a system more likely to take advantage of powerless people or result in the abuse of human beings? Here's something I didn't know at all, and I still find hard to believe. It is actually impossible, and I don't mean just difficult, it is actually impossible, illegal, to claim or introduce in your defense that racial discrimination was used in your arrest or prosecution. You can't do it. Even if you can statistically prove, through past case analysis and past evidence, that there is a pattern of racial discrimination on the part of police investigators and prosecuting attorneys, even then, it's against the law for you to even bring it up or bring it to the attention of a judge or a jury. This is the world we have created. My hope is that the publishing and the wide reading of Michelle Alexander's book is a kind of a wake-up call for our country. I know it's being talked about in many of the circles that I travel in, both within Unitarian Universalism and in the interfaith organizations that I'm a part of. And I hope the words of Dr. Cornel West in the introduction will prove to be true. He wrote, "Once you have read it, you have crossed the Rubicon and there is no return to sleepwalking. You are now awakened to a dark and ugly reality that has been in place for decades and that is continuous with the racist underside of American history from the advent of slavery onward. There is no doubt that if young white people were incarcerated at the same rates as young black people, the issue would be a national emergency." So what to do? First, we must cultivate some awareness. We can't sleepwalk through this. It's too important. It is way too important for the soul of our country and for the millions, literally millions, of precious souls that are being affected. Take the opportunity to get those opportunities that present themselves to get educated. There are wonderful resources out there, colorlines.com, dreamdefenders.org, the Black Youth Project, many, many others are wonderful sources of information. In the process of cultivating awareness, I believe you will discover that we are all going to have to learn to think differently about race and about racism. And just what do we mean when we talk about a multiracial, multicultural, but still somehow colorblind society? What do we mean? Can you do that? And here I'm going to quote my friend and my colleague, Reverend Mark Stringer. He wrote, "One of the primary contributing factors to our perpetuation of this racial caste system of mass incarceration is our yearning to believe in the possibility of colorblindness. In a well-intentioned notion that race does not matter and therefore should not be considered or counted. But in this yearning to leave racial difference behind, we have become blind to our common humanity. As Martin Luther King said, nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." So-called colorblindness is not the solution, it is the problem. Racial differences, so ingrained in our psyches, will always exist. The world is too diverse for them not to exist and influence us in countless ways. Our goal then should not be some kind of promised land of racial equilibrium, but a common understanding that we need to take into account our differences and care for each other accordingly. We need to see each other with all our faculties engaged and face the fact of our different experiences in this world. Alexander makes the point quite convincingly that the root of mass incarceration is the same root as that of slavery and Jim Crow. And so even a well-run and successful effort at reforming the war on drugs and the criminal justice system, as necessary as that is, will ultimately be futile. Just as slavery was replaced with Jim Crow laws were replaced by mass incarceration, and without addressing the deeper roots of unconscious prejudice, unconscious privilege, The deep assumptions that people who are out of sight can be out of mind, and their lives so different from ours that for all practical purposes we don't even see them as human beings. Without addressing that, even solving mass incarceration and the war on drugs will only result in something that will then replace mass incarceration. I have to believe, we can do better than that. I have to believe we can do better than this. I have to believe somewhere deep within us the angels of our better nature are singing there somewhere in the darkness, and we are better than that. And I know that the road to our better selves, to a better nation, to a better humanity is a soulful and a difficult road. And I know that we will need each other on that soulful, difficult road. Not one of us can do this work alone. We will need each other. We will need the voices of people who have experienced life in very different ways from us. And perhaps we will need an openness to whatever forces of divine love may be working out there in us or within us or among us or through us. I want to close with some words from the great James Baldwin. Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know that we cannot live within. I use the word love here not merely in the personal sense, but as a state of being, or a state of grace. Not in the infantile American sense of being made happy, but in the tough and universal sense of quest and daring and growth. Amen.